party are talking about leaving the coalition.
Oh, look, I think everyone's getting a little bit ahead of themselves. I mean, let me just make a couple of comments there. Firstly, the government is totally committed to meeting its ongoing treaty obligations. What we are doing is going through a consultation process now of how that might all work. I mean, the government on a number of fronts, and these companies on a number of fronts, have entrenched obligations, if you like. There are memorials on titles of a number of these companies, etc., etc. But what's true is that they're currently subject to Section 9 of the SOE Act, and because those companies will be coming out from under the SOE Act, then it wouldn't necessarily make sense for them to continue to be subject to Section 9 as it's prescribed in the law, because it's specific to the Crown. And of course, these will be companies that will have both Crown shareholders and private sector shareholders. So one possibility, and the government's pretty open-minded about this, is moving away under the new control of these companies, if you like, from general treaty legislation to specific treaty legislation, which would spell out that the obligations apply in terms of the treaty, as it logically should, to the Crown as a shareholder, but obviously not to a private sector shareholder. So there's a lot of discussion to be had. Water to flow under the bridge. We'll go through that process, but I'm confident we'll work our way through that. Well, my understanding is the Finance Minister's had a discussion with them this afternoon. He's pointed out that this is potentially an option available. We are open-minded to finding a solution. I would point out Section 9 is largely symbolic. It's been in the law since it was established in 1986, but the government can't find an example of where it's being used. The Crown, as I said earlier, is totally committed to its treaty obligations. They're well spelt out in the jurisprudence of a huge number of laws that operate that have an influence on these companies from the RMA down. And as I say, there's specific memorials on a lot of the titles of these companies. So it's just a matter of going through and working out a way to reflect that under the mixed ownership model, the only shareholder is not the Crown, it's a mixture by definition of shareholders.
Given it's not included in the comp supply agreement with the Maori Party anyway, is there much of an obligation on your part to consult and communicate with the Maori Party on this issue?
Well, there's a legal obligation to consult with Maori, and I think in terms of our wider relationship with the Maori Party, we would consult with them and take on board their views, as we will with other Maori interests over the course of the next few weeks. But you're right, there's no expectation that they will vote for the mixed ownership legislation. In fact, they won't vote for it. But we understand their deeply held views in relation to the treaty, and we're working our way through. I think we can find a pathway that will satisfy everyone.
What does this mean for the atmosphere at Waitangi?
Well, it's going to be a topic of conversation, but whatever happens, it's going to be a topic of conversation across the country. I mean, it's important that we spell out what we're trying to achieve. But as I said, we can't leave, in my view, that very general treaty clause that's there, because it wouldn't make sense, because it binds the Crown, and for these companies, they'll no longer be solely Crown-owned companies. That's the problem.
Has the issue of Section 9 been raised earlier by officials in the lead up to this sales process?
Well, it's been raised with various people. I mean, ministers have been aware of that issue for some time. There was a brief discussion, I think, with the Maori Party at some point, and there's certainly been discussions with other Maori leaders they've come to see me. It's an issue that we're all aware of. We're just working our way through it.
When was that issue raised with the Maori Party? Was it during the post-election report?
I've got a feeling we did, but look, I might be wrong. I mean, just in general, we've been well and truly clear about their position, their opposition to the mixed ownership model. And so, as I say, it's just a matter of making sure we can interpret the law sensibly. And the problem we've got is private sector companies and private sector shareholders in New Zealand are not subject to the treaty. The treaty binds the Crown and Maori. And so the Crown is not looking to discharge its obligations under the treaty, but we can't bind a private sector shareholder. So we just need to find a technical way through that.
So when you talk about having respect-specific treaty legislation, you're talking about a separate legislation for each of the SOEs, or a separate?
Well, however, because they're going to come out from the SOE Act, we'll have to work out how, what legislation is wrapped around them. There'll be specific legislation, and so we might have a specific clause for them.
And it would, from the sound of it, it might be putting treaty obligations on the private
No, no, that's exactly the point. It won't put private sector obligations or put treaty obligations on the private sector, and make it quite clear that the treaty obligations are there, but they're solely for the Crown.
But if the company is 51% owned by the Crown, surely the behaviour of that company must be dictated by the obligation by the Crown, since the Crown owns the most of the company.
Well, for the most part, that company will be anyway, because of the various engagement that company has with aspects of New Zealand law. So when they look at the RMA, for instance, there's a treaty clause there. And as I said, to the best of our knowledge, Section 9 has never been used. It's
transfer the sale at state assets into the SOE structures in the first place.
Yeah, 1986, when it was the SOE legislation was established, it was established as a general treaty clause, and my understanding at the time was that was the way we did those things, but as the years have gone by, we've moved to much more specific legislation.
So in the Murray Council case, it prevented the transfer of the assets into state-owned enterprises in the first place.
Well, I don't have any knowledge.
Injunction against the Crown from, I mean, is it possible that we could end up with this being taken straight to court?
No, not in our view. As I said, since the 1986 SOE legislation has been established, to the best of our knowledge, it's not been used.
So no matter what the Māori Party think or say, you're going to still get rid of the treaty clause?
Well, as I say, let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's a consultation process to go through, and the government's open-minded about how it might deal with that issue. What we are clear is that we can't put a treaty clause on private sector shareholders. So we need to find a way, potentially, to make sure we continue to express what is a statement of fact, which is that the government intends to maintain its obligations under the treaty. And so it might be a specific clause that simply spells that out. But that would be binding a private sector company, and we don't do that to Fletcher Building.
So in a practical sense, how could you bind 51% of what the company is and does to treaty obligations and have 49% off here floating freely? I can see, say, financial obligations you might be able to do that, but practical.
It's not. It's binding the government as the shareholder to honour its obligations under the treaty.
How seriously do you take the Māori Party's threats if we're not happy with the arrangement that you come up with?
Well, with all of these issues, there is always a process that you work through, and we're continuing to work through that process. I'm extremely confident that the Māori Party will remain part of the government over the course of the next 3 years. We'll continue to work our way through this, but as I say, we can't carry on, to the best of the information I have, with a very general clause when you have a mixed ownership model. It just doesn't work.
Have you got officials now drawing up a proposed clause to deal with it?
Well, I'm simply saying that is one option, and we'll be happy to go and discuss that with all of the people that we consult with, that we have this specific clause, general clause. No, the trouble there was that they were 100% sold, and so the Crown was no longer a shareholder, so therefore they weren't caught by treaty provision.
So do you think this is just political posturing by the Māori Party?
No, look, I think, as I said earlier, I mean, to give the Māori Party credit, they feel very strongly about treaty issues. I mean, the raison d'etre of the party is, as much as the foreshore and seabed, it's about their belief of the place of the treaty in modern day New Zealand. They care deeply about the constitutional review that's been undertaken, and we may have disagreements actually about certain aspects of the treaty and its reach or its meaning. That's a debate for another day, but we're not looking to discharge our obligations under the treaty.
But you can't go when you're in a previous relationship that you had under the previous government. There was no instances of, like in the Māori Party to walk out. I mean, that's a pretty serious thing to be saying, and you can't go saying that sort of thing casually, can you?
Well, I'd have to see the transcript and understand the full context of that. So I'm not going to go and comment on something that I haven't had an opportunity to fully review. I suspect it might be a hypothetical answer to a question that could be proposed, or under certain circumstances. But my point would be there are lots of times where there's been debate and discussion. Sometimes it's gone the way of the Māori Party and there have been changes. Other times there haven't. There was the same feeling around the Māori seats in the Auckland Council. There's been other examples where there's been concerns. We are different political parties, and we have a confidence in supply agreement which actively allows them to express their views, and they are doing that. In the final analysis, as I said, do I think this would be a deal breaker for the government? No. Do I think I'll find an elegant way through it? Yes.
The Māori Party saying while you're considering Hikoi and that this could inflame tensions at Waitangi this weekend, do you think perhaps you've underestimated the depth of concern?
No, I don't think we've had the consultation process yet. I mean, the ministers haven't even released that until tomorrow. So again, I just encourage everybody to look at what we're saying, recognise the practical issue that we face, and work with us to find a solution through this.
Is the real issue here that the underlying issue that the relationship with the Māori Party this time has been poorly managed and they weren't given the heads up?
No, I think it's a work in progress, and they are simply stating their view that they would have concerns if they saw what they would perceive to be a reduction in the Crown's obligations when it comes to the treaty. Now, my point to them and to you and to anyone else that wants to listen is there is no reduction in the Crown's obligation when it comes to the treaty.
Did you give them any assurances that as companies that are majority owned by the Crown that they would continue to honour their obligations?
Well, we've always made it clear that we intend to honour our obligations under the treaty, and as I say, there are lots of ways that occurs, right through from the legislation that these companies are actively engaged in, right through to specific things that are quite unique to those companies, like the memorials on their titles which cover land access and all sorts of other things. What we haven't done yet is worked out a solution for how the effect of Section 9 operates when you have a majority stake but not a 100% stake.
So would you expect those companies with 5149 in private ownership to honour the treaty?
I expect the shareholder, the government shareholder is bound because the treaty binds the Crown with Maori, not private sector shareholders. So in an incredibly hypothetical example, you wouldn't want to get to a position where someone owns 5% of a mixed ownership company, sells it purely as a private sector transaction, and that's somehow subject to the treaty, because it can't be, because it's not bound.
What happens when half these companies are sold? There's an action, the private shareholder wants to take an action that isn't consistent with the government's treaty obligations.
Well, there's never... Well, firstly, I think if you look at these companies, their record of actually engaging with Maori is very good. So, we've gone through that process to, we've asked the officials to look at it. My understanding is there aren't outstanding obligations, or there are lots of areas where they've engaged actively with Maori when it comes to water, when it comes to land access, it comes to a lot of different issues. So I'm confident that those companies will continue to honour their obligations and what they see as good business practice, because it's important. I don't think anything will change, because in the last, whatever it is, 25, 26 years, Section 9's never been used, even though it's been in the legislation that's covered them. So if it hasn't been used in the last 26 years, it's not going to be used now.
Arguably, the reason they behave so well is because they know that they're bound under Section 9 of the Town Enterprise.
Well, that might be true if they're bumping up against Section 9 all the time, but they don't.
And you also may have up to 10% foreign ownership in these companies.
Yep.
What do they know about the treaty? I mean, those shareholders may be pushing up pretty hard.
Yeah. But as I say, it's important to understand what Section 9 does and says, and Section 9 binds the Crown.
Yeah, so you're saying the Crown will dominate?
Well, the Crown's going to be dominant because it'll, by definition, own a majority share. But even if you put Section 9 and applied that general provision to these mixed ownership companies, it wouldn't be legally intelligent, because it would be binding the Crown, but not binding, in my reading of it, and I'm not the lawyer, the private sector shareholders. So we just need to address that issue.
Well, the question is, does it bind the board? Does it bind the director? Do they have to act in the interest of shareholders, or in the interest of the shareholders plus the big one?
Well, they act in the interest of shareholders. One of those shareholders, the majority shareholder, will be the Crown. The Crown's bound by the treaty.
But they will have an influence, though, won't it, on private shareholders, and I wonder whether that will strengthen the view that it should be New Zealand shareholders first, possibly it could be a disincentive for the overseas shareholders who don't understand the treaty.
Well, the practicality of it is Section 9 in the day-to-day running of these companies has proven over the last 26 years not to be relevant, because that's not the issue that's driving their behaviour. What is driving their behaviour is the treaty and the obligations that are enshrined in legislation that those companies actively engage in. None of that changes.
But it might become relevant because the private sector shareholders might want to take action that the government, as half owner, couldn't back because of the shackles of the treaty.
Well, you're getting into a hypothetical that I could go round and round in circles on, but it hasn't happened in 26 years that we've ever run up against Section 9. Yeah, and if you go and have a look at a 100% private sector owned company like Contact, it deals with all of these issues today, because it also deals with the RMA and all the other legislation that has treaty provisions in them, as other companies do. That's the point. The treaty obligations are expressed in principle and in practice through that legislation.
Have these companies actually told you that it's not relevant in their day-to-day operation?
Well, I've asked for advice on when Section 9 has applied to these companies, and the answer, or been used, and the answer it never has.
We know that it applied on their formation. Like in the formation of these companies, they were acutely aware of the existence of these provisions because they prevented their formation at all.
And we've been through that, which is, as I said, Geoffrey Palmer, when he established it in 1986, the SOE Act legislation put in place a general provision. Over recent times, the Crown has actively moved to more specific treaty clauses.
The provision is not being contested because the Crown entity is not breaking it. Doesn't mean that it's not being observed by the Crown entity.
Well, it hasn't been used.
Well, it raises the question whether the social responsibility principles of Section 4 will also not be transferred across to the new legislation as well.
I can't comment on that. I haven't looked at that issue.